And so the first question we grappled with in the class was, why do we fear death, but we don't fear the period of time before we were born, what we call prenatal non-existence? Because if you think about it, let's say you live to be 80 years old between 1990 and, 2070. You're terrified of what comes after 2070, a world without you. But you're not really terrified of, the 1800s, the early 1900s, a world without you as well. But it's asymmetrical, it's symmetrical. And one of my professors, the professor in the class, Paula Yorkrow, used to say that if you visualize your existence, it's an island surrounded at all sides by non-existence. Before you were born, you didn't exist. After you die, you don't exist. But the wrinkle is that the vast majority of people are haunted by their fear of the future non-existence, but not their past non-existence, which is nonsensical. Death is the mirror image of the prior abyss. And since no one finds it disturbing to contemplate the eternity preceding his own birth, why should we be perturbed by our posthumous non-existence? Why should we care about what happens after we die? And so this was a question that we posed again and again. Why do we have anxiety about the future but not the past? And let me give you an example. This was something from the class to really illustrate this question. Let's say there's a man who is temporally neutral, meaning he cannot see time. He cannot see the past or the future. Every event just looks the same. And let's say this temporally neutral man wakes up in a hospital bed, and the nurse tells him, "Good news, your operation happened yesterday." The ordinary person might be relieved. "Oh, it's over. Thank God. It's in the past." But this temporally neutral man would react with perplexity. His response would be, "Why is that good news? My ordeal is just as painful, it's just as long, and it's just as much a part of my life. Why should it make a difference to me now that my ordeal is in the past?" So this is a temporally neutral attitude. The temporally neutral attitude says that it doesn't matter if something's in the past or future, it's still the same experience. But this temporally neutral attitude, you've probably figured out it's not realistic. This isn't how humans are hardwired. At our core, we're predisposed to be biased against future pains. And in terms of that human bias towards the future, let me give you another example. And this was again something we covered in the class. We all know the difference in our attitude that we would take if we were told we had a terrifying toothache as a child, as opposed to being told that such a pain awaits us in 10 minutes. Right? Imagine that. If someone were to tell you, someone were to impose upon you the pain of a toothache 10 minutes from now, as opposed to just having you recall the pain from when you were, a toddler. It's a completely different situation, and that's because as human beings, we naturally focus on future evils. We consider these with fear and anxiety rather than past ones, which we kind of regard with a lack of interest. And this bears in mind the conversation I had with my guest Jeremy Pachter a couple episodes ago, where we talked about how there's no such thing as the present. All of us are always living in the direction of the future. As you're thinking, forming your thoughts, and the action potentials are firing along the synaptic connections in your brain, right? Like nothing is happening at the exact moment in time. It's always geared towards the future. And it's not just our fears, our desires are also forward-looking. Someone would say, "I want to go to Venice next winter." You wouldn't say, "I want to have gone to Venice last winter." That just sounds syntactically confusing. I want to go to Venice next winter, not I want to have gone to Venice last winter. We're eager to anticipate. We're eager to experience. We're eager to want future pleasures, and we dread future pains. Even though, you guys, even though we look upon past pains and past pleasures both with apathy. This is the crazy part with the asymmetrical attitude with which we view time. If there's a painful experience from our childhood or something, a time that we looked upon with pleasure and anticipation, we will look at them both with apathy. Because anticipation cannot have a backwards looking counterpart. So again, this begs the question, why is death even such a bad thing? If we try to have this temporally neutral attitude. And it really has to do with loss and deprivation. Okay? Because if we look at prenatal non-existence, the period before we were alive, that doesn't deprive us of anything. We weren't born, so the non-existence that we experience, we're not losing anything. But if the root of the fear of death is the termination of life, then the prenatal non-existence, there's no termination. It comes before life. There's no loss. Death is the loss of life. If that makes sense. I know it might be a little like circular. So if you look at the death of someone at 24 years old and the death of someone at 82, when the 24-year-old dies, it's tragic because he could have died later. He could have lived, 60 years longer, could have experienced a lot, but it's the loss of potentiality, the loss of the rest of his life. But when the 82-year-old dies, it's not as tragic. Because he's not losing as much. He's not being deprived of as much. We talked about, or I alluded to, the visceral tragedy of a child's death and how they're deprived of a future overflowing with happiness and prosperity and achievement and success. That is a tragedy because of the loss. Whereas when someone dies of old age, death in and of itself is tragic, but not comparatively so.